You have this written down, but CAFOs are concentrated animal feeding operations. Okay, and so it's a place where a lot of animals are confined in a small area. And the problems are waste builds up. You have this written already. And disease spreads quickly. So a lot of times they use a lot of antibiotics. Okay. So those are some of the problems with CAFOs. And you can see there's pictures. We've seen pictures of chickens. We've seen pictures of pigs, all of that. So we're going to talk about this briefly. I might show a video clip on it tomorrow, but tomorrow's mostly going to be a review. So genetically modified organism, an organism whose DNA has been altered in a lab. So what they can do is they can take DNA from one organism and put it into another organism. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, there are a lot of crops out there that have been genetically modified. And they've been genetically modified to produce a toxin that's harmful to insects. Okay? And what that toxin does is that toxin was originally from a bacteria. Okay? And this bacteria produced a toxin that was harmful to insects. And so what they did is they took the gene for that toxin and they put it into crops. And now some of our crops, we don't have to use these insecticides or these harmful chemicals because the plant produces a compound that makes the insects go away on their own. Okay? So is that ethical? Is that a problem? The big question is, well, a lot of times people don't know yet because we're going to look at a graph. These have only been around not very long. So some advantages: increased crop yield. We can create organisms that are resistant to pests or drought. So this is what I kind of wanted to do before I decided to go into teaching. I wanted to go into sustainable agriculture. And so what I wanted to do was develop crops that could be used in Africa or Asia and developing countries that would be resistant to drought, and so would help them kind of fight hunger and be more sustainable. And, you know, I ultimately decided I didn't want to work in a lab forever, but that's kind of what I wanted to go into. They might have increased nutritional value. Remember we talked about that golden rice with vitamin A to help prevent blindness, okay? So how many of you would eat something that's genetically modified? Guess what? You already ate something that was genetically modified, probably more than one thing. If you ate anything that came out of a box or a package or a bag today, you ate something that was genetically modified. So the majority of our processed food, what do we mean by processed? Well, food that doesn't look like the actual food it came from. So like cereal, is there a cereal tree? No. Okay. Chicken nugget, is there a chicken nugget tree? No. Or, you know, so a chicken wing is one thing, right? It looks like the animal it came from. Or an apple, okay, it comes from an apple. But when we start getting these processed foods like that have a lot of ingredients, like Cheetos or, you know, yeah, anything, soda, chips, candy, a lot of what's marketed as a junk food, all has corn in it, okay? So I guarantee you ate something with a GMO in it today, okay? Because most of the corn in the United States is genetically modified. Now you're like, well, Ms. Frankston, I didn't eat anything with corn in it. I bet you did. Do you know how many things have cornstarch in them, or corn syrup, or other ingredients that come from corn? So the United States is the biggest producer of genetically modified crops, okay? We grow 70% of our crops are, or sorry, 70 million of our hectares are genetically modified, okay? Europe does not grow any genetically modified crops. Why? Because they've banned them, all right? They have determined that they don't know the risks, okay, because they haven't been around long enough, and so they said you can't grow or sell GMOs there. So we look at genetically modified crops, 1996, okay? We had less than 20% of our crops were GMO. Now, 2014 and beyond, okay, 80 to 90% of our crops are genetically modified. And these are specific crops, okay? So it's not all crops. These are specifically corn, soybeans, and cotton, okay? So basically 90% of our corn is genetically modified now. So the top foods that are genetically modified in the U.S., soy, cotton, corn, and then canola, Okay, and canola oil is used in a lot of processed foods. Take a look at this list. Anyone see anything they like up there? All of these have genetically modified ingredients in them. Okay? Now, am I saying don't eat these? No. I'm just telling you they have genetically modified ingredients in them. Okay? There is not enough research out there to determine whether or not they're completely bad or completely good or whatever. Okay? So there are a lot of different viewpoints on this. What can you eat instead that are not GMO? This is GMO. What can you eat instead? Basically, a lot of stuff that you would find at like Fresh Time. Okay? So like Kettle organic sea salt chips, Trader Joe's organic corn dippers, Mary's Gone crackers, right? Okay, basically none of the stuff that you see normally marketed in a supermarket. All right. So the concerns, are they safe for human consumption? This is the biggest concern. Can these genes that we changed, can they spread to wild varieties? So can the pollen from this spread to a wild variety, and then can they contaminate our natural varieties? And there's no regulations on labeling. You might see that it says non-GMO verified. Okay, that is a true label. We talked about natural being like not a very good label. It's no standard. It's a true label, but they're not required if it's GMO to put anything on their food label. All right, here's what I need you to write down in red. A fishery, okay, is a place where fish are raised for commercial purposes. It could be in the ocean. It could be in a little pond. Worldwide, 90% of our fisheries, or 90% of our fish, have collapsed, okay? They have declined. 90% of our fish. We have fished 90% of our fish out of the oceans. There is a time where scientists believe that in the future, if we don't change, we could end up without fish, okay? If you look here, here's Atlantic cod in this graph. We have a steady number. It peaked, okay? And then all of a sudden, it completely declined. We're eating more fish these days because our human population is growing. Well, the problem is we're fishing all of these fish out of the ocean faster than they can replace themselves. Remember, we talked about maximum sustainable yield, what's the most you can get from a place without depleting it completely. And then another problem is bycatch, okay? So with bycatch is all the extra fish that you catch when you go to try to catch your whatever, lobster, crab, whatever. So like here's a turtle. He got caught in a net because they were trying to fish some kind of fish and he got caught. Here's kind of a picture. It's kind of grainy, but here they're catching fish. Well, look, they got all these sea stars. They got all of these other things too. Because when you're fishing, you just have a big net and it gets whatever it gets. And a lot of these organisms end up dying because, well, they have to sort through them, and by the time they sort through them, they're already dead, and so they just end up dead. Or here's another picture, okay? Again, you see these other organisms. Fish. Fish are the #1 top producer of bycatch, or shrimp, sorry. Shrimp. Shrimp are the #1 producer of bycatch. For every 1 pound of shrimp that you catch, 9 pounds of other seafood are thrown away. 9 pounds, okay? So shrimp and fishing, right, are a big, it's a big problem because these fish are declining, okay? And we talked about fish farming as a way to kind of help alleviate that stress on the oceans, but we also talked about the negative impacts. So what are our options then for sustainable food and sustainable agriculture? How can we raise enough food to feed the planet? So the first option is something called intercropping. Inter means within or between. And what this means is 2 or more crops are planted in the same field together. So rather than a monoculture, we're planting a variety of crops. Okay? A good example is with Native Americans. Native Americans came up with this method. It's called the 3 Sisters method. They use this a lot. The 3 Sisters method is because these 3 crops are grown together. How are they grown together? Well, you grow a corn stalk. Okay, you've got corn. And then you grow beans. Beans have to climb up something. So the beans use the corn stalk to climb up. The beans are also a legume. Legumes add what to the soil? Nitrogen, right? And corn needs a lot of nitrogen. And then you have squash down here. So we can plant all three of those crops together, and that's going to prevent our soil from getting too depleted of nutrients, because whenever we plant just one crop on there, we run the risk of depleting soil nutrients. We also have crop rotation. We do this a lot in the U.S., even though you might not notice it, okay? A lot of times farmers will switch between corn and soybeans. So they'll plant corn in their field one year, and they'll plant soybeans in that field next year. So changing the crops that are planted in a field from season to season. And again, this is good because it allows the field to recover, and it changes the nutrients that are being taken up by those plants. So if you plant corn, which uses a lot of nitrogen, the next year you plant soybeans, which add nitrogen to the soil, you can prevent your soil from getting depleted. The next one we don't see a lot in around here, but it is called agroforestry. Okay, so with agroforestry, this just means we plant trees in with our crops. And when we plant trees, those trees help prevent erosion. Because remember, those trees have really strong roots that hold the soil in place. And again, we don't see this a lot here because we're all about industrial agriculture. I've seen this a lot in developing countries because the trees actually provide shade. Notice this is kind of on a hill, so it would prevent erosion when the water comes down. But here we would say, well, we can't get a plow through those trees, so that would be a waste of our time, okay? Because a lot of times in the U.S., we're planting stuff just to get profit. So agroforestry, agriculture and forest. This is a big one. I've seen this on AP exams. So contour. What's a contour? So you've heard of contour. Girls have heard of contouring, right, on your, to make certain parts of your face stand out. Contour means like a curve, essentially, right? And so what happens here is we're plowing and harvesting using the contours or the curves of the land. And this is important. Reason it's important is because otherwise we're going to get a lot of runoff. So imagine if I have a hill here, okay? If I plow with my little tractor straight down this hill, I'm essentially making little rows, right? Imagine corn, rows of corn going down this hill. I'm essentially making big waterways for all of this water when it rains to come down, and it's going to erode all of this, okay? Now, if I'm a farmer and I have a hill, and I'm plowing around the hill, okay, and planting stuff around the hill, when the water comes, it's not going to have these natural paths, and we're going to get less erosion, okay? So you'll actually see this. If you see an area that has hills and it's being farmed, you might see that the plowing or the planting doesn't go in a straight line. All right, no-till agriculture. What is tilling? What does it mean to till? My last class, yeah, turn up the land. So my last class didn't give me a very satisfactory answer, so I am going to show you what tilling is, okay? Tilling is using one of these big machines. You can use a rototiller, one of these, okay? And basically it turns up the land, okay? It turns over the soil, okay? And Here, I'll show you. Then,
For every challenge.
oh, fudge. We have to watch an ad. But I want you to know and understand what tilling is, okay? So tilling is turning over the land. So this guy's going through with the rototiller. He's got a really overgrown area, okay? And notice it's just turning over the land. Why do you do that? Well, you can get rid of weeds before you plant, and because it makes the soil spread out, not super compacted. So this is a rototiller, okay? You can rent one to go put in your garden, right? It turns the soil over so you've got like fresh soil from underneath. But every time you do that, it's going to increase the chances for erosion because you've got more loose soil. It's not held into place. You're breaking up all the roots that might be in there. And it also is going to increase the amount of herbicides you use, because what's going to happen is all of those seeds for the weeds that were buried underground, are now going to come up to the surface and they're going to germinate, and you're going to get a whole bunch of weeds. So people have to use a lot more herbicides, okay? All right, stick with me. We're almost done. Integrated pest management. You guys did this. You looked at this. We'll look at it maybe a little tomorrow. So many techniques used together to reduce the amount of chemicals used. Another example, I'll give you another example. Let's say you have mice, okay? Well, cultural, what could I do? Well, I can make sure I don't leave food out for the mice. Okay, physical techniques, I can make sure that I cover up any, like, caulk any holes where they could get into my foundation. Biological, I could buy a cat, okay, or have some kind of other animal that increase the owl population, okay. And then last resort, I can have rat traps or use some poison bait, okay. So integrated pest management. Lastly here, an option, organic agriculture. Organic agriculture just means they did not use pesticides or fertilizers. And the key here is synthetic, man-made, okay? They can use natural fertilizers, for example, manure. They can't use any unnatural or chemical fertilizers. Okay, so let me show you organic, what's allowed and not allowed. Okay, basically a lot of stuff's not allowed. Can't use toxic pesticides, no GMOs, no antibiotics, no growth hormones. They have requirements on animal welfare. Cows have to be on pasture for pasture season. Okay, natural, remember we said that's kind of like a fake thing. They can allow GMOs, antibiotics, growth hormones, pesticides. There's no requirements for animal welfare, anything like that. Okay. Second to last slide here. So what are some options? Free range meat. We can have animals just graze. If they're spread out, they're going to have less disease. They don't have to use much fossil fuels. The manure is going to be recycled, but it requires more land. And if profit is your main goal, it's a lot easier just to shove a whole bunch of animals into a small area and make money than it is to provide land for all of them. And last but not least, fish farming, aquaculture, farming of fish. You can just write farming of fish. Okay, apparently you can seaweed farm too. Pros, we are not overfishing the oceans then, because we are having these fish that we're growing in little pond, tank, net things in the ocean. Cons, wastewater, disease, antibiotics. What happens if our fish escape and our fish have all of these kind of like chemicals and antibiotics in them, and then they bring all of those with them? So that is what I wanted to finish with for notes.